All right. Happy Thursday again from the top. Welcome to your Purchase Ready Academy, right? Purchase Ready Academy, our new learning hub for Florida realtors, teaching you guys all things purchase and sale in this environment that we're in now in Florida. So today's discussion, again, as I indicated when we first got started, today's our wrap up of our 4-part series, Get It in Writing. Today's topic is the residential purchase contract and rider updates for 2025. So the hope is in this quick lunch break we have together, we're going to go over some of the key changes to the purchase and sale contract, as well as the riders that you guys absolutely cannot miss in your structuring, streamlining, putting together your processes and procedures for working with buyers and sellers, right? These changes are not just for buyers. This is buyers and sellers these changes impact. A lot of familiar faces, some new faces. For those who I have not had an opportunity to meet before, my name is Ray Cole Jackson. Nice to virtually meet you if I've never met you before. I am a South Florida real estate attorney. Many of you know me as the title attorney, founder of Title Experts. A little bit about me personally. I am from Florida, originally from Miami. I attended the University of Florida, Go Gators, the 2025 college basketball champions this year. I went on to Santa Clara University where I obtained my law degree. And I came back to Florida, Miami specifically, where I attended UM and got my LLM in real property development. I am a licensed Florida real estate sales professional, a licensed loan officer, and I truly, truly, truly enjoy the opportunity to pretty much share. Many of you guys know that I don't necessarily just teach this. I am in the business. I am a investor outside of the title company, the law firm, and loan origination. I do sometimes represent parties, mostly as an attorney. You guys know I don't do much on the purchase and sale side as a realtor. Those deals I refer out to the group. But what that means is when we come together on Thursdays, guys, know that what I'm sharing with you is what we're implementing in our own back office, right? This is what we do. Myself, my business partners, we're in the trenches along with you. One thing I can say for sure, and I understand that I have the benefit of, as an attorney, when these changes occur in the forms, yeah, of course, I'm going to understand it probably a little bit deeper. And what I quickly want to do is to help you all understand it, number one, and then number two, implement it in your business easily, right? My hope for you is that you not struggle with, number one, again, understanding the changes, and then two, implementing the changes in your business so that you're comfortable, compliant, and being compensated for your services, because many of the changes that have recently been made are all around your compensation. I shared with the group last week, a misstep that a realtor recently made that hopefully that works out concerning their compensation, but there's some true implications of not understanding the changes that have been recently made, and then as well as implementing them properly, okay? So again, getting back to today's discussion, we're specifically hitting on the purchase contract and the riders. Over the last few weeks, we discussed what? The buyer brokerage agreements. Then we went on and we discussed the compensation agreements, the seller compensation agreements that should be executed before you show property, right? If you're representing a buyer, you should have a signed compensation agreement from the seller, assuming they've agreed to provide compensation to you, assuming that is an offer, then you should have that signed before you show the property, right? Otherwise, you potentially just spent your wheels on now having to have a conversation with your buyer about compensating you if they are in fact interested in purchasing that property, right? So that's what we talked about over the last two last two sessions. In this session, we're discussing the contract, the purchase contract, and the rider, right? Anne-Marie sent an email, a very good question. And this is a concept that by the time we wrap up today, you guys should have a handle on. And that is, what are the documents that I should have executed by the time this file goes to title for closing, right? What documents should I have in my hand if I represent a buyer, if I represent a seller, by the time this contract is fully executed and we're on our way to closing, right? You should understand that, and we're going to go over that by the end of today's discussion, all right? So why does this matter? Again, just reiterating, you should absolutely have at your fingertips. Electronic version is great, but I would always suggest that you print out your templates, your most up-to-date copy of your contract templates, right? The purchase and sale contract, the riders, the compensation agreements. Have those things printed and marked up. You'll see I have them printed. These I just recently printed as I was preparing for today's class with you, and mark them up. But most of you know that these will then go into my binder because I have everything in a binder, right? So I suggest to you that the handouts that you guys have received over the last 2 sessions, as well as what you'll receive today, for those of you that are just coming in, check the chat. Many will be sending you directly, if you're coming in late, a link to the handout. Go ahead, as we're going into today's discussion, make sure you download the handout. The handout for today has the purchase and sale contract, and it has the riders that we are discussing. Okay. All right. You're welcome. We got you covered. Listen, if I'm going to be organized, you're going to be organized. We ain't come here for nothing. Right. So let's take a look at the latest and most important changes to the residential contract templates. All right. So the purchase contract. I am not going to assume that every realtor on the line is aware that there are 2 different forms of the purchase and sale contract. Every time I teach the contract class, I make sure that we level set and we're clear and we understand that there are 2 main forms of the purchase and sale contract. There is the contract for residential sale and purchase. We call that the CRISP. The most recent version is the CRISP 17. It's the 17th version of that contract. It is the contract for residential sale and purchase. And then we know that we also have the as-is residential contract for sale and purchase. What is the difference between the 2, Ray Cole? The CRISP starts from a place of the seller agreeing to make repairs to the property up to a certain amount. The CRISP, contract for residential sale and purchase, it starts from a place of the seller agreeing to make repairs to the property up to a certain dollar amount. In comparison, the as-is contract, it starts from the position of the buyer purchasing the property as is. Seller does not agree to make any repairs to the property of any dollar amount. You take the property as you find it. The as-is residential contract for sale and purchase is also the most prevalent utilized contract here in Florida. 99% of contracts are going to be the as-is. I honestly have not seen a CRISP in the last few years come in for closing. All right. It's just the preferred form of contract. You can use either one. The as-is just the one that's most commonly utilized. It is the one also that when you attend classes, it is most commonly taught because it is most commonly utilized. But now, with that being said, realtors, don't assume, right? This is in a contract class. When you receive an offer, you want to make sure that you are receiving the version of the contract that you know, like, and trust, right? And so what you see me highlighting here on the screen is the very bottom of every contract template is going to be the name of the document, as well as when it was most recently, the version of it that you're utilizing. Okay. So what we're talking about today is the as-is version 7. And the changes that we're going to discuss are in the version 7. They're not in the prior version. So if you are either making an offer, and most of you're going to be utilizing the forms that are in, either Form Simplicity or your brokerage's database. And most of them are the most current versions, right? You're not going to just go Google as is contract and pull it into .loop. Hopefully you're not, right? And so you can kind of be sure that you're using, for that reason, you can be sure if you're using your brokerage's database of templates that you're using the most recent version, okay? So make sure the three changes that were made to both versions of the contract, of the purchase contract, both the crisp and the as is. There were three changes made to both of those contracts that you need to be aware of. The first change is in paragraph 9. The contract has better defined closing services. They now have a definition of closing services. They reference the statute. It's pretty basic, nothing critical, except that the Florida Realtors, Florida Bar Committee, who drafted the contract, they wanted to be clear around what is described as closing services, because the next change that was made to the contract in paragraph 9 is that it is now clear that each party must bear their own closing costs and the cost of closing services. I'm going to tell you that what that means in layman's terms. In layman's terms, that means the buyer is going to pay pay a settlement fee. The seller is going to pay a settlement fee. What has happened in the past, in some cases, is in counties such as Broward County, or where the contract negotiated that the buyer would select the closing agent, because paragraph 9 of the contract was not clear that the seller needed to pay a settlement fee. Unfortunately, sometimes you would have some sellers that say, who told you I was paying a settlement fee? You chose that title agent. You're paying for the closing services. And there would be a battle there. Well, that discussion is now off the table, because the contract in paragraph 9A is now very clear. And what you guys have in your handout is the red line version, which I know can be kind of hard on the eyes, but it's, at least for the purposes of you guys seeing where we were and where we are now, it's a good reference. Obviously, going forward, when you print out your versions, you're going to have the version that has already, the changes are already made. But for the purposes of today's class, it's good for you to see where the changes have been made. Okay, so that was the first change. The second change in paragraph 15, kind of bad, but it was revised to remove the provision that allowed for a cooperating broker to request half of the listing broker's retained deposit. Some of you might not have even been aware that that was in the contract. Well, prior to this change, in the event the seller canceled the listing for whatever reason, they did not proceed to closing, and the listing agent, by virtue of the terms of their listing agreement, was able to retain take a portion of the deposit. So say, for example, the buyer breached, a portion of that deposit, the deposit went to the seller, and the seller gave the listing agent a portion of that deposit for their time. Well, the contract previously allowed for the buyer's agent to participate or take a portion of that deposit that was provided to the listing agent. Does that make sense? Right? Buyer default, seller retains the escrow deposit. Seller says, oof, I know you spent a lot of time. Here's half of the escrow deposit. Well, prior to this change, buyer's agent is saying, well, give me half of your half, please. Thank you, because I spent time as well. So that's what the contract previously allowed for. That now is removed. The third change to both the purchase, to both the crisp and the as is now we have check boxes for the compensation riders or credit and compensation riders that we're going to discuss later in our time together today. All right. So those are the three changes that were made to both of those contracts. Now, an additional change that was made to the crisp is that it now calculates time in calendar days. Calendar days. Previously, the crisp used business days. And if you were calculating time periods using business days, what did that mean? That means you would skip holidays, you would skip Saturdays and Sundays as you were counting towards finding your deadline. That is no longer the case. Now, in both the crisp and the as is, you utilize calendar days when you are calculating your time periods. Okay? Same standard now for both. Time periods will end at 11:59 and 59 seconds, local time, meaning where the property is located, right? And then also, I want you guys to know that there are certain provisions, particularly in the crisp, where the language will say prior to a particular date, prior to a particular date, or within a particular time period. And what that means is that if it says prior to, and say, for example, that deadline falls on a weekend, then you need to take a step back to the prior calendar day that is not a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. Does that make sense? You do, if the language says prior to or within, you don't roll forward because it has already said it needs to be prior to this date. If it says on a particular date, then you roll forward. But if it says prior to, you need to go take whatever number of days back to fall on that calendar day that is not a Saturday, Sunday, or national legal public holiday. All right. So here's an example to clarify that. You need to understand this. Most of you won't use the CRISP, but it's important that you understand this. So let's work through an example really quickly. Grab your phones, pull up your calendar, go to Tuesday, April 1st. Okay. So buyer and seller execute a contract, a CRISP, on Tuesday, April 1st, right? They left paragraph 6 blank, referring to the earlier of 10 days after the effective date for the inspection period to end, all right? First of all, our effective date is, we'll assume it's the 1st. I'm going to drop in here. The effective date is the date when what? The last party has signed and it has been delivered. That's another class, but I got to always drop that in there because that is always a point of confusion. The effective date is the date when the last party has signed and it has been delivered, right? And then when we're counting, the effective date, when we're counting, is day what? What day is that? 0. That's day 0. We start counting starting the next day, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. So in this example, the inspection period begins the day after the effective date, which would be the 2nd. And so let's count 10 days. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? You would not, it would end on the 11th. We did not skip Saturday and Sunday. Previously, with the CRISP, where we use business days, you would have skipped Saturday and Sunday. We no longer skip Saturday and Sunday. These contracts are exactly the same as it relates to calculating time periods. All right. So shouldn't mess that up because again, most of you don't even use the CRISP. But if you do use the CRISP, if you find yourself, you'll remember the old way of using business days is no longer the case. Okay. Here's something that may or may not have gotten on your radar. The flood disclosure. Flood disclosure. Starting October 1st of 2024, there is a new flood disclosure requirement in Florida. Florida Statute 689.302 requires a seller to complete and provide a flood disclosure to a buyer of residential real property. Everybody know that. The disclosure must be done at or before the time the contract is executed. At or before. So for that reason, if I were you, listing agent, I would treat this as you treat your HOA rider, your condo rider. Have this already signed, have this in the MLS, provide instructions for the buyer to have this executed with their offer. Flood disclosure is required at or before the time of the contract being executed. We're always talking about systems. We're always talking about efficiency. Go ahead and place this in the MLS. On the screen, we see a screenshot of the flood disclosure. It's a very simple disclosure. The seller's just going to indicate whether they filed a claim with their insurance provider relating to flood damage, or whether they've received assistance from FEMA for flood damage. We know, talking about global warming, we're talking about coastal lines changing, we're talking about sinkholes here in Florida. This is why this is coming up, right? And so now sellers need to disclose whether or not this property has flooded, right? We know we talked about in Fort Lauderdale, right? Flooding. Did this property flood? For whatever reason, did this property experience flood damage, right? This is required. Systems, again, listing agent, go ahead and sign it, place it in the MLS. Buyer's agent, go ahead and be looking for it. Make sure it's on your checklist so that it's provided to the buyer, okay? The condominium writers, now you guys know that this writer has, and the required documents around condos have been changing since Surfside. And so starting January 1st, 2025, the condo writers were updated. There's a requirement for conspicuous language. Conspicuous means clear language regarding 3 types of reports regarding condominium properties: the milestone inspection, the turnover inspection, and the structural integrity reserve study. Acronym is SIRS. You guys have both of those templates in your handouts. Here's another point. Notice comprehensive rider. Some of you guys probably already know this if you're old school. You know that there's a different rider for if you're using the CRISP versus if you're using the as is, right? There's a different, and both of them are in your package. If you're using the as is, you need to use the appropriate rider. If you're using the CRISP contract, you need to use the appropriate addendum for that contract, okay? So these templates provide 3 different scenarios that the seller is going to confirm. Number 1, is this condo association required to complete those 3 reports and they have not completed them? Number 2, are they not required to complete those 3 reports? Or 3, the association is required and they have completed them. Those are 3 different disclosures, 3 different scenarios that the seller must disclose with regards to a condominium property. Understand, if the seller does not meet those new requirements, the buyer can cancel the contract. It is voidable at the option of the buyer prior to closing. Talking about protecting your deals, protecting your commissions. Here again, we talked about the flood disclosure. Let's go ahead and just have this form completed and uploaded in the MLS. We're talking about systems. We're talking about not missing anything, right? It is important for a seller to provide accurate answers to the buyer about these 3 documents as it pertains to those 3 scenarios, so that the buyer does not exercise their right to potentially terminate this contract. Anybody building a checklist in their head while we're going through this? Right? So I mentioned earlier, the FAR bar, this is their rider. Not for townhouses. Nope. Good question, Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie's question is, do we do this for townhouses? No. Townhouse is different from a condo. Townhouse is different from a condo. All right. Townhouse is similar for the purposes of this, and title even is considered like a single family residence. All right. But that's a very good question. So this is the form for the as is, the FAR bar form, rider A, condominium rider. And it's also A for the CRISP, if you're using the CRISP. As is contract, CRISP. As is contract, CRISP. Okay. This is for the other rider. Okay. All right. So just to provide a little bit more clarity on those riders, as you guys would expect, the seller needs to select the appropriate box. And if they have any questions about whether or not their condo project or how to complete that, which of the 3 scenarios that this condo project falls under, they need to contact the association, right? They need to contact the association, okay? And if for some reason they are unsure still after speaking to the association or unclear, then they need to seek legal advice. Under no circumstances, guys, should you guys try to provide legal advice or sort this out, right? Under no circumstances. Okay. Now, I almost said the most important part is not, but you know, the compensation riders, the compensation riders. Don't forget the compensation riders. So going back to Anne-Marie's question, I'm going to recap this now. We're going to talk about it again at the very end so you guys are clear. I represent a buyer. By the time I get to closing, I should have, and if I have a scenario where the seller has agreed to offer some form of compensation, I should have my buyer's brokerage agreement. I should have a seller compensation agreement executed. Of course, I'm going to have my purchase contract. And then I'm going to have one of these riders. That's 4 documents that I should have executed by the time this file is ready to go to closing. Was everyone prepared for that? You have a checklist ready for that, right? There's 2 riders potentially that you would utilize based upon the scenario. In a scenario where the seller has agreed to provide a credit so that the buyer is going to use it towards the agent's compensation, then you're going to use the credit. You're going to use the credit rider. Double F. Credit related to buyer's broker compensation. Okay. Buyer has entered into a separate brokerage agreement as may be amended, which is not incorporated herein with, and I want to make sure I point this out. I mentioned this before. Guys, you do not need to share your buyer's brokerage agreement with anyone but your broker. You do not need to provide it to the listing agent. You do not need to provide it to us at closing. We are not going to enforce or interpret your buyer's brokerage agreement as it relates to for example, making the closing agent making us aware of what you should be compensated. You provide that information when you complete your intake form. You do not need to share your compensation agreement. Here's why. For example, your compensation agreement says that you've agreed to be compensated 2% by your buyer, but this seller was offering 3%. Well, you've said 2%. So guess what? I'm not going to give you 2%, right? You do not need to share that. That's on a need to know basis. And the only person that needs to know the terms of your buyer's brokerage agreement is you, your buyer, and your broker. Okay. At closing, seller agrees to credit buyer the sum described below, which for disclosure purposes, only to the parties agree is related to buyer's obligation on a buyer's brokerage agreement to pay such and such. So, and you would say, in what scenario would I use this? You would use this in a scenario where, for example, the seller initially did not agree to provide any compensation to the listing agent. But based on you negotiating with the parties, they've agreed to provide a credit that the buyer is going to use to compensate, use towards your compensation. You would use this rider. Okay. I see your question, Chandra. Give me 1 second. You would use this rider. Alternatively, a scenario where you have a compensation agreement already executed with the seller. Seller's already agreed to compensate 2%, 2.5%, 3%, 4%, 5%, 6%, right? That compensation agreement with the seller is already executed. You're going to be utilizing rider GG, seller's agreement with respect to buyer's broker's compensation, as the rider to your purchase contract. Understand that this rider is the contract between the buyer and the seller. Your compensation agreement is the agreement between the seller and the brokerage. We talked about this last time. So we got to always be clear. When you say, well, why do we need the compensation agreement and why do I need the rider? Well, again, we're talking about enforcement. The compensation agreement is going to be enforceable between the seller and the buyer's agent, brokerage. Or if you utilize the seller, the listing brokerage compensation agreement, it's going to be enforceable against the listing brokerage, right? I think, well, I don't know, because I know someone else mentioned that some brokerages have requirements as to which compensation agreement you must use. So I'll put that there, right? When we get to the rider, however, the rider is enforceable between the buyer and the seller. So I'm going to use an example for you to provide you some clarity. You have your buyer's brokerage agreement. Great. That's enforceable against the buyer. Buyer, you agree to compensate me 3%. You have your compensation agreement. Seller with buyer's brokerage. They agree to 3%. Great. You have your purchase contract. I agree to purchase your property for $4 million. Great. But you forget to get the compensation rider executed by the seller. Guess what you have? You have no ability to enforce compensation requiring the seller to pay the buyer's brokerage compensation as between the buyer and the seller. You have no agreement. Everybody clear on that? This is important. So you might have recourse as the brokerage against the seller, but that's a whole separate conversation. That's a whole separate legal action that you're going to have to pursue. But as it relates to ensuring that you're paid at closing and that you can cancel this transaction if the seller does not follow through with paying your compensation, without having this executed, you have nothing. So to answer Chandra's question, the 4 documents that you're going to have in a situation where, in a transaction where a seller has agreed to compensate the buyer's brokerage, you're going to have the buyer's brokerage agreement, you're going to have the seller's compensation agreement, right? You're going to have the purchase contract, and then you're going to have the rider, seller's agreement with respect to buyer's broker compensation. Right? Those are the 4 documents you're going to need. I want to do a quick hypothetical. I want to do another quick hypothetical to make sure that we are clear as we move away from this topic, at least for this month. I believe it's going to come back on, and you guys have access to the recordings. I think we're going to come back on this in June, maybe, or July. But this is important, and I'm seeing this so much. And so we may do some quick pop-ups. I want to do this quick hypothetical. Buyer, you represent the buyer. You have a buyer's brokerage agreement executed. Buyer has agreed to compensate you 2%. You show property to the buyer. Seller is agreeing to compensate you 3%. How many documents will you have at closing? Drop it in the chat. How many docs will you have at closing? Give me a number in the chat. How many executed documents will you have by the time you get to closing? Drop a number in the chat. Oh, I see somebody might be paying attention. Oh, I see somebody's paying attention. If you said 5, come off chat. I mean, come off mute, I'm sorry, and tell me what your 5 are. I see Deborah, I see Beverly, I see Sophia.
Hello?
Yes, give it to me, Sophia.
All right, so it'll be the 4 that we discussed: the rider, the purchase contract, the seller compensation, the buyer broker agreement. But because I'm now getting paid 3%, I need the addendum, I forgot the name, but showing that
For modification.
Modification. Yes.
Woo! Yes, you got it. You got it. Is everybody clear on that? So I threw a little twist in there. She got it right away. I told you that your compensation agreement was at 2%. Sellers offering 3%. Because you cannot be paid more than you've agreed to in your buyer's brokerage agreement, you're going to need to get a modification of your buyer's brokerage agreement executed so that you can be paid the 3% as well. Put those agreements in the chat. You will need them listed, Dave, you're saying? I'm going to read them off. I'm going to type, but then you'll have the recording. Number 1, you're going to have the buyer's brokerage agreement. Under this a standard scenario, buyer's brokerage agreement, compensation agreement, purchase contract, and then your rider. Assuming, again, this is assuming you have an agreement in place for the seller to either compensate you, provide your compensate you, or provide a credit. The hypothetical I provided was compensation was at 2%. Your agreement is at 2%. Seller's willing to compensate 3%. In addition to the 4, you need a modification to the buyer's brokerage agreement because you cannot be paid more than your agreement provides for. Your buyer's brokerage agreement provides for 2%. Seller's paying 3, wonderful. You can take it, but you need to get that modification executed as well. All right. All right. Good job, Sophia. What other questions do you recommend? Absolutely. So Anne-Marie's question, do you recommend when I get the listing agreement signed that I get the compensation agreement signed in advance? Yes, but don't place it in the MLS. Do not. Do not place it in the MLS. I'm glad you asked that question, Anne-Marie. Do not place it in the MLS because remember, nothing concerning compensation can be posted, communicated, shared in the MLS. You'll have it available maybe in your dot loop or whatever your signing platform is, or even you could just send it out, right? So that it can be signed and sent back. All right. Anne-Marie says listing agreement has a compensation too, so that's not enough. It's not enough for what? It's not enough to change the compensation for the buyer's agent. No. Lewis says, when do you do the modification? You do the modification when you have confirmed that the seller is offering a higher compensation rate than you have agreed to with your buyer. So immediately.
I was
right?
just saying, recall that like since it's in the agreement, the seller already knows because they wrote it in the listing agreement that they were going to pay the buyer agent. So so like I feel like it's redundant to have the other paper because like your seller is signing in the listing agreement that they're willing to give whatever they're going to give to the buyer agent. So
I'm glad you asked that question. So going back to listen to what I'm saying. I'm glad you asked that question. Going back to who is the listing agreement between? Who are the parties to the listing agreement?
Right. It's between me and the seller, but it still says, doesn't it still say in there that he or she's willing to still give buyer agents, buyer agent, whatever amount?
Right. But because it's between you and the seller, who has the right to enforce it?
Okay. So, right. Okay. So then we just need to sign. Okay. So when I do a listing agreement,
let's finish this thought because you get it. And somebody, just in case someone else in the group doesn't, because the listing agreement is between the brokerage and the seller, and only the listing brokerage can enforce it against the seller. That is why you need the compensation agreement, because you need an agreement that is enforceable against the seller as between the buyer's broker and the seller. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think when I get a listing, I'm just going to save myself the time and just get all the papers signed up front. It's just easier.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Get
Absolutely.
the flood, get everything signed up front, because it's so stupid to just get a listing agreement. Then you got to keep going back and forth to the seller. Hi, now you need to sign this. Now you need to sign this. So
yeah, you definitely, exactly. You would not do that. You would not do that.
No.
You would not do that. The only way you would do something like that is if you, maybe there's some specific or unique circumstances to compensation in that transaction, and you would do a compensation agreement unique to that transaction. But outside of that, yeah, you would just have one standalone compensation agreement that you share with the buyer's broker when they reach out to confirm the compensation available.
So if I'm doing a listing as a seller agent, all I need is a listing agreement and the flood paperwork and the buyer compensation form signed on a townhouse.
Correct.
Okay, so just those 3 papers.
Well, if you're in a townhouse, you're probably going to have the HOA too. The HOA.
Yes. Yes. Okay. And I have all the paperwork for the HOA with all the information I would put on the MLS for everyone to. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Right. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Question. No problem. Did you receive my email response? I had asked you earlier.
Actually, no. I don't know why. Maybe it went to spam. I have to check.
For me, it shows that it wouldn't deliver. It kicked back, so I don't know why.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I didn't go at all. All right, guys, on the screen for access to the recording, to the handout, access our school community. We have a new school. We have a new community where you guys can go in and get your questions answered. You're going to have, if you have follow-up questions, we have a post there. We have a Q&A post there where you can ask your questions, your follow-up questions regarding the content, or if you're in a transaction situation. Hopefully, if it's not urgent, don't put something in there at perfect, Beverly. Don't put something in there, 11 o'clock at night and you're going to a listing appointment at 8 a.m. Like, that's not going to work. It's a general question, a follow-up question on the content. Post it there and you'll get an answer. And again, the recordings are there, the handouts are there. So make sure you guys join the school community. Also, make sure you follow us on Instagram and Facebook, whichever is your social media platform of choice. Because on there we do provide updates and some daily kind of pick-me-ups from the academy. All right, Charmaine, question. I see your hand is raised.
Yes.
Go ahead.
If that is missing, does that also allow the contract to be voidable?
Voidable, yes, voidable, not void.
Voidable, not void, right?
Voidable.
Understood.
Exactly.
Thank you.
No problem. Almost forgot. Next month, we are in our new series, Contract to Close, Successful Navigation of a Florida Residential Real Estate Transaction. So we are starting a new series. Feel free to welcome some of your colleagues who could utilize this information. So on May 1st, turn-by-turn navigation of a Florida residential purchase transaction. For those of you new and experienced, if you need a refresher on what it looks like, high level, 30,000 foot overview, what does the process look like from contract to close? That's for you on May the 1st. On May 8th, managing purchase contract timelines to avoid delays and default. That's going into more detail about calculating time. Guys, listen, newer, newest, not as new, still struggle with how to calculate time. And can I tell you, that is a death knell in your transaction if you miss a deadline. I'm very honest with you. All right. The 15th, protect the escrow deposit. There's a lot of confusion around when the escrow deposit is at risk and how a buyer or seller, particularly, can collect the escrow deposit. That's going to be the conversation on May 15th. May 22nd, clear to close. Do you really know what it takes for a loan to get clear to close from a lender? And what does that look like? And what does that mean, right? Just because they say clear to close doesn't mean you crank up the car and run down to, come to the office for closing. But what is the lender doing? What are they working through? What are they from a very high level? What happens with a buyer when from the time they go, when they make a loan application to getting a clear to close, right? If you don't know that, you should know that. And then lastly, see you at the closing table. That's another 30,000 foot overview. So you can see what happens with a transaction once it comes in for closing. What is the closing agent doing? Why are they asking for this particular information? What could create a delay in my closing? That is going to be discussed on that final Thursday in May. Don't miss out. Again, if you guys are, I think if you're signed up, you get a notification every time. I don't know. You have to ask Mindy about that. But in any event, make sure you share this out. Again, this is critical times, guys. There's a lot of information and there's a lot of changes that have been made to how you do business. This is not the time to kind of get sleepy on it. This is a time to be very vigilant about making sure that you're looking at your checklist. Anne-Marie asks questions every week about, okay, so I should have this, and this. Yes. And it's going to make your business not only more sustainable and more safe and predictable, but it's going to make you more profitable, right? It's going to make you much more profitable. This is how you scale. Sophia, you have a question?
Hi, yes, quick question. As a listing agent, if a contract comes, an offer comes, and the buyer's agent is using Chris, but we desire the as is, can I request that to be changed?
Yes, ma'am. That's funny. You absolutely can. I
Perfect.
literally just had that come up on a file that just came in for closing. The agents were like battling. He's like, I can require that they send us an as is, right? Yes, you can. And I just want to provide a little bit more clarity around that too, as to why. That's a term, right? The terms in the CRIS are different than the terms in the as is. And so everything about your transaction are terms that you're negotiating. And so you're simply saying, my seller does not want those terms. My seller wants it as is. And of course, here we are. Someone might be wondering, well, can't we ask for credits? Yeah, you can. You absolutely can. That commonly happens once you go into the inspection period. However, understand with the as is, you're starting from a place of as is. The CRISP, the language in the CRISP literally has that the seller will make repairs. Full stop. The as is, no. Complete opposite. Okay. Any other questions before we get out of here? No? All right. That was a lot of information. Guys, make sure you access the recording in school. Yes, you'll still have access to the recording. All recordings will be posted, I guess, by the next day, Minnie. Put y'all out there. By the next day in the school community, you'll be able to access it there. All right. You're excited? I too. I'm super excited.
One more question. I'm sorry. Can I
Uh-huh.
bother you? What do you think about also adding in the seller, when I sign papers with the seller, also to just have them fill out the property disclosure form?
Sure. If it's required, that's a whole nother conversation. You guys.
Oh, okay. No, but I'm not sure because I don't think it's really required, right? But I just see the paperwork and I just feel like
it is not required. A property disclosure is not
so I
required.
just feel like I don't know if we
It's
have
not
to
required. Now it's not required. However, the buyer can request it.
Right. Okay. So then at that point, if they request it, then have them fill it out and share it.
If they agree to it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't sure if it was required before you go to final closing, that they would want to have the property disclosure.
Mm-hmm. Another question in the chat. If I want to put 20% down, could I do a 5% initial down and the rest in closing? How do I present my offer? So two, depending upon what your when it comes to when you say down,
I'm gonna put the fan on, baby. Okay.
For me, I look at down.
Yeah, it's the only one we have, baby.
Let's mute.
I'm sorry.
There you go. Down as in the loan, or are you talking about the earnest money deposit?
I'm talking as the loan, like 20%. Give it 20% as a loan, but when I present my offer, I would like to give like 5% just in case something happened. I want to hold the rest of my money, present it at closing.
Okay, so let me clarify that. So you have two different things. The loan, the 20% down. So if a loan requires 20% down, let's say it's an investor loan, and the loan requires 20% down for financing, that's going to be cash to close anyway. Does that make sense? So you don't put 20% down when you go under contract. However, you do make an earnest money deposit when you go under contract. So if you are trying to say, I'm going to put 20% of my purchase price down as an earnest money deposit, you can do that. And you can do 5% first and then 15% at another date. The purchase contract allows for two separate earnest money, a first and second earnest money deposit. But I want to make sure that there's a difference between earnest money deposit and a down payment for the purposes of financing.
Okay, so that 15%, I have to do it as a second initial down payment?
So again, I want you to use different verbiage.
Yes.
I want you to use earnest money deposit if you're referring to earnest money deposit.
Okay.
So are you referring to earnest money deposit?
Yeah, earnest money deposit, yeah.
Okay, so if you are saying, hey, seller, I'm going to make a earnest money deposit of 20%, You can say the 5 and whatever that number is, 5% will be provided or will earnest money deposit will be made within 3 days of the effective date. And then the other 15% will be made within 10 days of the effective date. You can do that. But again, that's cash up front, earnest money deposit versus down payment. I want you to use the term down payment when you're referring to financing. Because when you're financing, if the lender says, yes, we'll give you a loan for the purchase of that property, but you're going to have to make a 20% down payment, that down payment is your cash to close. That money's going to come to closing. It's going to be paid out at closing as cash to close. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see the difference. Thank you.
Perfect. Good.
Yeah.
I'm glad you asked the question. I'm sure others have learned from that. So again, I just want to make sure that you use different terminology. Down payment is related to financing. Earnest money deposit is related to going on the contract. Yes, cash made deposited to the closing agent when you go on the contract. Very good question.
Very good. Thank you.
All right, guys. Any other questions before we jump? No? All right, you guys have been wonderful. Feel free to, again, make sure you share this out. Anybody you think that could find value in this series, and we will see you. Thanks, Chandra. We will see you guys in the community.
Absolutely.
Right. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye-bye. You're welcome, Anne Marie.